Hello, very good evening to all of you. So this is our 15th presentation of Facebook Live Challenge, and we are till now we were doing it thrice a week, but from next week onward we will do it twice a week because in most of the hospital people have started working and workload is increasing. So I think we will do twice. And another new thing, which is TED Talks. It will be case presentation by PG against teachers of a task group, and they will learn how to present this. They will learn how to do give practical exams. So it will start this weekend only, and the first of this series will be Saturday. So we will announce it soon. So today's presentation is by Dr. Preeti Kanodia. It is about Anastasia Mishap, and she's universities in Mumbai. She has a bright academic career. She won Best Paper Award in ISACON 2000, ISACON Maharashtra in 2000. She did a fellowship in laparoscopic anesthesia in Royal College of London. Then she did fellowship in laparoscopic and pediatric anesthesia in France. She got in public awareness in Isakon, Maharashtra. Then she taught roughly 10,000 people on World Restart a Hard Day. And she is certified COLS and BCS trainer. So she is going to talk with us about anesthesia mishaps today. I'll hand over to Preeti Madam to talk about anesthesia mishaps and what it taught me. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Hital, sir. Good evening, everyone, each one of you who is here today. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Anesthesia Society, which is so much like a family to all of us, and especially Dr. Hital Vadera, Dr. Anil Sharma, and to each one of you task members from whom I have learned so much during the last few years. I appreciate the fact that this is a platform where we are all students and there is this continuous medical education that is happening 24 by 7 for 365 and sometimes 366 days a year. To be pitted in the same week as Dr. Hitendra Mahajan sir is a huge and a humongous task for me. So let me attempt to attract and sustain the few eyeballs that I shall generate from now on. Let us begin with a little exercise which is pretty interesting. This is not a test, it is just nominal, and everything is going to be explained. There is nothing to worry about. Read out loud the text in this triangle below. Most likely, most of us will read a bird in the bush. If that is what we said, we fail to realize that the word the is mentioned twice in this particular figure. One more. What do we see here? Most of us teach, and when we see what teaching reflects, if we see in the reflection below, it reflects as learn. Only when we teach, we all learn, and when we all learn together, we grow together. Last one. What do you see here? The ones who are looking at the brown letters will see the me. The ones who are looking at blue will see the you. Correct? Let us not get into the me and the you and the you here. With that, I invoke the blessings of Ma Saraswati as I jump right into my topic, which is anesthetic mishaps and what it taught me. Now, my story begins in the early 2000s. Okay, this is a time when I had just finished my training at a premier institute in Mumbai, with all the best facilities, state-of-the-art infrastructure and everything that was available to a student, to a postgraduate student. I had done very well. And my day one of rural practice, I got married and I started practicing in a very rural area. This is again on the outskirts of Mumbai, around say 35 kilometers to the north of Mumbai. And practice here was extremely difficult, or actually it was not difficult, it was just the opposite of what we got. All the facilities and the faculties that were available there, none of them was here. I was now thrown into a place where there was no electricity for long periods of time. Water was a scarcity. Even infrastructure, I had no idea what was going on. But then I was a fresh graduate with tons of confidence and zero experience. I would go here another step further to say I thought I was the queen of the free world of private practice. So this is what happens on one afternoon at sometime just after lunch. I got a distress call for CPR from an anesthesiologist in another hospital. It was a case of full-term vaginal delivery in an unregistered patient. Now, this is 20 years back in a rural area where getting unregistered patients was a norm. There was nothing like if my patient is not registered, I will not take her up. Every patient who walked into that hospital or to reach that hospital had to come from a considerable distance. So they were all accepted. Whatever came was accepted in whichever way it was. Now, patient delivered and the anesthesiologist was called for a manual removal of placenta. This anesthesiologist decided to give Diva. Now, during my course of my talk, let us just be very clear that we are not here to judge anybody, to condemn anybody. Everybody who has done cases as a trained anesthesiologist is a qualified person. So there is no judgment here. This is purely a series of mishaps that has happened, what we have learned from it, and how we can incorporate these teachings into future practice, especially for the young anesthesiologists who are now stepping out into the future. This particular patient was decided that we would give Tiva to the patient. This was the norm in those days. Even now it is a norm in many places today. Sodium pentothal was given, and the usual story, relaxation was not enough. So then the surgeon or the obstetrician becomes an anesthesiologist, and the next request is, can you give a little bit Scolin to the patient? The patient is not relaxed. Okay, Scolin is given. Still there is no relaxation. No, I still can't feel the placenta. I need some more relaxation. Can you please give some halothane to the patient? The people who are actually working in rural areas will really relate to this, because this is how the story goes. Okay. Excuse me. And the cycle of IMS, that is intermittent scoline, begins. This was what I was trained at that point in time. This was a norm. This was how it was going on. The first shot of scoline would be given, and then 100 milligrams of scoline, that's 2 ml of scoline, along with 1 cc or 0.6 milligrams of atropine, would be taken in a 10 ml syringe and diluted to 10. So as the patient came out, small aliquots of maybe 10 or 20 milligrams of scoline would be given. Patient would relax and the procedure would continue. So this kept on happening till the procedure was over. Now this particular thing was also used for many other procedures. The struggle went on for over half an hour, and that is when I got a call for help from this hospital. An urgent call for help. Fine. When I reached this particular operating room, this was a new hospital to me. I was a new person in private practice. I had never seen the interiors of this hospital before. You have to imagine the scenario here now, a little bit of imagination. That's why there are no pictures here. This is like a whole floor of a chawl has been converted into a hospital, a nursing home. So there is a series of small rooms beginning with an OPD and then the wards. And the last two rooms were the labor and the delivery ward, as well as the OR. So it was like the OR was on one corner of the hospital. No problem. When I go in, I see a patient who was pulseless, an anesthesiologist who was literally gasping, forgive my theatrics, and a frantic surgeon who was on the phone in the corridor. Now this was a time when none of us had cell phones or anything. So all phones were landlines, and we had 3 or 4 digit numbers at that point in time. So you had to go via whatever operator or something. And there was ambu mask ventilation going on. Fair enough. Monitor, I saw a finger pulse ox probe that was being used. And what struck me was there was no ECG monitor. 20 years back, rural settings. Please do not judge here. Brief history of the patient that I received from my colleague was that the placenta was removed in bits, and when I asked how much of drug had been used, this was the answer I got. A whole vial, that is 20 ml or of scoline, had been used up over the last whatever time they have been doing, and a whole 30 ml bottle of halothane had been used up, and the patient was still bleeding. So now, what do you want me to do? So then we decided to, patient was pulseless. So I asked, how long has the patient been pulseless? The answer I got was just when you walked into the theater. Till then she was all right. Okay, I accepted whatever was there. Blood sample had already been sent for typing and cross matching. There was one peripheral IV access, and in those times, Himaxil was the only plasma expander that we had. We did not have the Haystar or the Haysteril or the whatever the newer ones that were there. This was the only thing that was available. So I got hold of a staff and just gave her a 5 ml syringe and asked her to keep pushing this. And we started CPR. Now this was, a male colleague. He said, I'll do the CPR. Will you hold the mask? I said, okay, fine, no problem. CPR started. In the meanwhile, the defibrillator had already been asked for. It arrived from a neighboring hospital that was there. One shock of 200 joules was all that was required for this patient. We got the pulse back within a shot, which is good. In the meanwhile, I had managed to intubate the patient and I turned around to look. I could not find a socket in that hospital, in that OR. I looked around for a Boyle's machine. There was a Boyle's machine that was actually pushed away, backed to a corner of the wall. There was no socket connected to that Boyle's machine. And there were no cylinders, neither on the Boyle's machine nor anywhere in the OR. I was stunned, shattered, startled, speechless beyond words. I had no expression. I didn't know what to do. So I asked him, how have you been doing your GA cases here? The answer I got was, I've been using the Ambu with the tube. I said, no problem. How did you use the halothane for this particular patient? He just picked up a Goldman vaporizer and there was some contraption that he had made. So it was the endotracheal tube, then there was a Goldman's, and then the Ambu bag which was connected to an oxygen cylinder. So this was the kind of jugaad that was going on. Anyway, I couldn't judge anything at that point in time. Fine, I told you have to take on the ventilation because I don't know how this works. EJV had come, we'd given a head low, so we got the EJV and that was EJV was taken and we actively started warming this patient, warm IV fluids, warm towels, everything we had started for this particular patient. By that point in time, the second surgeon who was called had arrived. Both of them together reached a decision for exploratory laparotomy for this patient. So the next thing done was to take a consent. An ex-lap consent with SOS hysterectomy was taken. When the laparotomy was done, this was what we found. A uniconnuate uterus with a large extension of the tear right from the cervix to almost up to the fundus on one side. Okay. And there were a lot of clots, there was a lot of bleeding that was there. So it was a no-brainer. We had to do an obstetric hysterectomy. Everything was done. And while that was being done, I got the hemoglobin, which came as 4.6. Okay, so now we already needed, the blood was, getting cross-matched. Now, thankfully, we had a very good blood bank in the neighborhood. And we were able to get multiple packed RBCs, FFPs, platelets, everything was given to this patient. We are very lucky when we are working in a rural area. Very, very limited stuff around, but still somehow everything works. This patient did well. She actually went home with the baby, though she was, cursing us till the end because all she had to take home was a female child. But the good part was she did go home. Fine. What I learned from this particular case was practice can be extremely dangerous. An obstetric case, is never a minor or a small case. Things can go sideways very fast. There is always limited infrastructure, limited resources, and limited help because there are such few qualified people around you. It's very difficult and everybody is busy. Every hospital at that point in time needed anesthesiology services and they were not enough. Today there are enough people around. I mean, you throw a stone and probably you'll hit an anesthesiologist. But in those days, it was very few. Which is why your plans from A to E always have to be ready. Expect, anticipate, think beforehand. And that day I realized that I needed to upgrade every setup that I would walk into. Now this particular hospital, which sounded so pathetic when I entered or when I started explaining to you, I worked for 14 years in that place, and in those 14 years, this hospital owner was so kind and so forward in his thinking after we had a few mishaps like this was. He has two hospitals. So in both the hospitals, we have two proper modern state-of-the-art workstations. Both places have sevoflurane vaporizers, and proper multi-para monitors along with ETCO2. Plus, there are ward monitors. Everything was possible. 14 years is a long time. It took me some time, but it happened. And most importantly, call for help early. Everywhere there is a mishap, we realize that somewhere there has been delay in calling for help. It has to be very important. Now, winding back to a few years back, this was during residency. I was in my second year of residency. You know how we all are, college toppers, very enthusiastic, very earnest. We want to do well. We want to be the first ones to do everything, supremely confident of yourself. I was pestering my OT in charge to let me do a case single handedly. I had finished my first two posts and this was my third year. So I was pestering that person till they let me do this particular case, which I'm going to talk about. So this was my first independent case as a junior senior, what we used to call. It was a 28-year-old, 28 kilo male patient who had a tuberculoma on scans. The plan was a craniotomy or boreholes. This patient was taken up in emergency because he had already convulsed a few times. He was drowsy, he was disoriented, worsening, fever, tachycardia, counts were rising. He was not in very good condition. So my boss probably thought, what worse can she do? He's already, circling the drain. She cannot, really push him in. All she has to do is do the case. Let her do it. And that was how I landed up doing the case. In those days, a death on table consent was considered to be very fashionable. So anything that was high risk was ultra high risk or it was a death on table. And that made for very good coffee table conversations in the evening. Once the case was over, we would all brag about it. I did a DOT patient today and the patient survived. So that was like, a big thing for us. And in this particular case, my boss said, I will come in to assist. There will be no junior or senior along with the two of us, which was very good. I mean, I was on top of the world. So in this room, it is just him, it is me. There is a staff nurse who's busy with her trolley. Certain as usual in the coffee room and chatting up his friends. And me, mentally preparing for the treat, the treat post-op that I have to give to everybody in the OR team for successful completion of my first ever independent case. So I had, I could literally see the stars up there in the sky. Now here, this is how we began the case. The boss said, I'm going to sedate the patient and you are going to manage this case. So I'm oxygenating with one hand and with the other hand I'm adjusting the monitors, getting my equipment ready, my laryngoscope, my tubes, and everything is getting ready. All the while chatting up the patient, talking with the patient. This is a patient who's not really listening to me or responding, but they're talking. I'm talking. And then I realized that after a while, during the same time, there is this patient has stopped moaning, and whatever guttural sounds that he was making has stopped. And I realized that the patient is not breathing right now. What I do next is very simple. Just pick up a laryngoscope, pick up an ETT, and intubate the patient. This is the time when my boss's eyes, literally popped out. I don't have words to express how he looked at me. There was a mixture of, surprise, little bit of annoyance, little bit of, are you mad? Are you nuts? Sort of a reaction that came up to me. And I was like calmly, no sir, this patient has stopped breathing. So I've just put in a tube. All I did was I just picked up the circuit, connected it, and then you look around for the other drugs. Okay, fine, now patient is already relaxed, so I need to sedate, something I need to give extra. And then when I was looking around, I realized that the syringe for relaxant was empty. Instead of pentazocine, Pavlon had been given to this patient. This was my introduction to LASA. Now let me tell you why that happened. In residency, in every theatre, our norm was we were given a syringe tray. And in that tray, we had around 20 syringes that were loaded and labeled. Everything was labeled, but all the labels looked the same because we made it ourselves. So it was like atropine, adrenaline, midazolam, Campos, pentothal, and pentazocine, and everything was lined up. Pavlon, atracurium, even the reversals would be lined up. Everything. So 25 syringes over there. He just picked up a syringe and he injected, and there was a particular order in which we kept it. But he was busy talking to me, he just picked it up and injected. This is what had happened at that point in time. Anyway, we could manage this patient. Patient was already bad. They just decided to put in boreholes. By the time they made those 3-4 boreholes, they realized that the amount of pus that came out through it meant that there was very little brain matter left inside. Everything had pulverized and liquidated. The patient did survive this surgery and died soon after. But anyway, it was not on me. Here I'm going to hold on what I learned from this particular case because I want to pair it up with my next case. Next case again was a manual removal of placenta. This is again in my private practice. I was in a place where people were very fertile. So my practice was like 80% of obstetrics and very little of other cases at that particular point in time. This was a primey, was uncooperative, absolutely prolonged labor, maybe I think some 12 or 14 hours of labor or something. She was really exhausted. And as is typical in rural areas, there was no consent for LSS. The patient was howling, shouting, screaming, exhausted. You have that typical odor that is coming out of them from dehydration. But the relatives are saying, wait for some time. So it's an extremely difficult vaginal delivery, and after delivery she was bleeding torrentially, and they looked through the placenta. They were not sure whether it was an incomplete placenta. Later on we came to know it was a succenturiate lobe, but at that point in time the placenta looked okay, just one rim of it was raw. And that was when I got the call for anesthesia. Now again, you have to remember, this is a rural place. I did not have cell phone. I did have a pager at that point in time. So I was just, we were informed if there was a patient in labor. Patient in labor, please do not disappear. So that meant don't go for a movie, don't go out for dinner, don't go to a place where you can't come from. If you're going out somewhere, take your car with you. So your equipment and all that comes with you wherever you are, and see to it that you are approachable and you are coming back immediately, because the next, there is no call that is going to come. It's only going to be a page. So I knew about the patient. I knew that she was adequately fasted. And by the time I reached there, the consent for general anesthesia for manual removal of placenta was already taken. 2 IV lines had already been taken, as I had told them earlier. Keep them ready. So IV lines were ready, they were wide open. Pulse oximeter and ECG were the only two monitors that were available and necessary back then. Oxygen was given to the patient. And the obstetrician was a friend of mine. So then they said that we would give a paracervical block. So your drug requirements for the patient would be less. Fine. I had a basic Boyle's machine with everything I needed at that on that day. Laryngoscope and ETT were already ready for me, and a DI cart. Now you have to remember that at that time a DI cart meant extra tubes, one size bigger and smaller. I did not have nasopharyngeal airways, so it was just orotracheal airways, oropharyngeal airways. And I had my own set of LMS, so that I had carried with me. There was a bougie which I carried with me, and stilette and whatever else. The hi-fi stuff was not there. I gave standard drugs: midazolam, pentazocine, oxygen, nitrous, halothane. Pentothal sodium was given. Tranexamic acid I had at that point in time, so that bolus also had gone in. And what I kept ready was Pitocin. Now in those days, we used to keep Pitocin 20 units in a full pint of 5% dextrose. That would be ready. Methergine 250 mics was loaded and ready to be given intramuscular, intravenous, whatever required, and prostadine was kept ready. Now here I know that this person does not have any respiratory issue. There is no history of asthma, no history of cough, cold, fever in the last few 38 kilometers away from Mumbai. But in those days, sending a patient to Mumbai, we were not very sure whether the patient would make it within an hour or it would take around 5 to 6 hours to reach Mumbai, a good setup in Mumbai. Many of our patients lost their life along the way. So we were always erring on the side of probably a little overdosing the patient. So 20 units of Pitocin, Methergine, prostaglandin, everything was given to the patient. We couldn't afford a PPH. We would rather give blood and save the patient or do a obstetric hysterectomy than try to transfer this patient, because there was no saying when this patient would reach the hospital. Here, and in this hospital there was a beautiful in the sense, a lovely RMO, lovely as in she was very efficient, very good. She knew which patient would deliver, she knew which patient would require a section. Even post-operatively she would monitor our patients very fine. In short, it was somebody whom I trusted. So I told her, you will be giving the intramuscular prostadine and I will be managing the rest of the case. Now what happened here? Now this part is very important, okay. The placenta comes out. I turn around to stop the halothane. Oxygen and nitrous are continued till the patient comes out of the effect of halothane. The Pitocin drip running in full speed, just the way we like it. Okay, and I realized that this animal standing next to me is sobbing. Everything is going fine. There was no reason for her to sob. So I asked her, "Why are you sobbing?" This was what she told me. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. The syringe." She had actually poked the patient. When I told her, "You just keep the needle in the this, in the thigh of the patient," she had poked the patient, and she just had to inject it before the hand came. After the hand came out, the syringe fell down. She picked it up, and in a hurry, 250 micrograms of prostadine was given intravenously by mistake. I had nothing to say. There was pin drop silence around me. All the jaws that were there around me had dropped down. All the eyeballs that were there were, staring at me, asking me what I would do next. And I actually felt like a deer in headlights. I had no explanation. I had no idea what to do. This was a time when none of us had cell phones. We tried calling another few anesthesiologists. This was around 8:39 in the morning. So there was no free anesthesiologist who could come and help me out. And none of them who were asked could offer any plausible solution to what I was facing, because the answer was always the same. We have never given intravenous prostadine. Wait for the spasm. That was all I got. So, and I was also relatively new to practice, just 3 or 4 years into practice. So I had no idea how to deal with something like this, what to expect and what would go wrong. Should I start with Derifylin? Should I start an aminophylline drip? Is there something else that I can give to the patient? Am I going to jail? Is my patient going to die? These are the thoughts that came to me. That particular day I was convinced कि कुंभकर्ण के बाद अगर कोई ढंग से सोया है तो वो है मेरी किस्मत. For those who don't understand Hindi, Kumbhakarna was a demon, a mythological demon, who was blessed with this boon of falling asleep at any point in time for any amount of time till he woke up on his own. So it could be a few hours to a few months to a few decades to a few centuries. It was only one particular conch shell that would wake him up. So I thought probably my luck was also sleeping with Kumbhakarna that day. What I did was, I just went back to what I had learned during my residency. There was a 10 ml ampule of aminophylline, 5 ml was diluted to 10, given slowly as a bolus over around 10 to 15 minutes. The remaining 5 ml I put up in a dextrose and started an infusion. I was holding an oxygen mask, plain 100% oxygen, nitrous has been switched off. One ear on the chest, that's how we anesthesiologists use it. One of the ear of the stethoscope is in and the other one is outside, so you can hear whatever is going on around you. That is how I started off, and then I was just waiting for the spasm to occur. But somehow, and praying, everybody here, I must have prayed to every god from every country that I knew, or whatever I could do. It was just like, oh God, please take me out of this sticky one. And I promised to, I made a lot of promises later on. Anyway, and this was the time when Three Idiots had released. So I had one clown in the OR who was, all is well, that was going on. So it was pretty funny that way. Thankfully, the spasm war never came. Patient woke up properly. In spite of her being awake, I sat with her in the OR, monitored her for 2 hours, and then sent her to the ward on ox for the next 4 hours. She was fine. She didn't give us any more trouble after that. Now, what I learned from both these two cases. First thing, trust no one. Whether it is your senior or your junior or anybody. The way I said, I trusted that girl very well. You can believe on somebody, but don't trust them completely. Rehearsals, audits, sim. If we have been hearing stalwarts in our group itself, Dr. Pandya also, he always says that, always run regular sims, have audits. Every time you have a critical case incident, run audit. So this is actually being followed in teaching institutions. What I'm trying to put here is this can actually be done even in small nursing homes. What we can do is, if something like this happens or before like this happens, when we have free time in between cases, we can always get our staff together, get the RMOs together, discuss case scenarios, see what is where, discuss what is to be done in a problem, and find solutions. So there are clear roles for everybody who's in the OR. instructions that we give should be very clear. There should be nothing like please give this or to that. When you are giving a syringe to somebody, you have to explain what is there in that syringe, what do you expect that person to do, and how to do it. Both these cases taught me, in fact, the second one more so in practice, the importance of closed loop communication. In simple terms, it means when I am a team leader, I say something to you, you are going to repeat to me, do the action that I have asked you to do, and repeat it saying it is done. Now, in this particular case, had I told her, I did tell her, give intramuscular prostaglandin. The syringe fell down, she picked it up. Had she said giving prostaglandin intravenously, had I heard her saying that, I would have probably stopped time. Intramuscular prostaglandin 250 micrograms intravenously is a never event. This should never have happened. So this is something a very important that it taught me on that particular day. No matter what happens, see, we are all human beings. Accidents are going to happen whether or not we want it. A calm and a clear mind, difficult, it's easier said than done, but that is what is going to help us in difficult scenarios. Coming to the next case, this was a distress call. Actually, this is a case I have taken some time back in one of the conferences, a very interesting one. This was a distress call I got from a surgeon very recently who said on the phone that this anesthesiologist is not able to intubate a patient that I have posted for a simple laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And it really, it really annoys you when some surgeon is talking like that about your colleague. Intubate karna hi nahi aata, please come. It was annoying. So all I said was, okay, fine, just put me on speaker. Let me hear the tone and the pitch so I know what the heart rate and the saturation is. I've been to this hospital for a few days. So I know. And this case was being done by the regular anesthesiologist of that hospital. I am the one who is, number 2 on their list. So I knew their infrastructure well. All I had to tell the anesthesiologist was just hold the mask with 2 hands, use high flow oxygen, go up to 8 liters, and I should be there in 5 minutes. I was very close to the hospital, so there was no problem there. Now when I get there, this is what I see. This is something all of us see very commonly. I see a sweating patient, a sweating anesthesiologist. The theatre staff and the moushis are all sweating. Where is the surgeon? There's no sign of the surgeon around. The surgeon is sitting, both of them are sitting in their air-conditioned cabin, explaining to the relatives how the anesthesiologist is not able to manage the patient, and now they have had to call another specialist from outside to salvage this person as an expert. Okay, I was hearing part of it as I walked towards the OT, so I knew that something was going on. And here I see there is, my colleague is holding the mask with both hands. Patient has started breathing. There were jerky breaths, but breathing spontaneously. Oxygen sats coming up, 92 to 94%. There are tears of relief, literally tears of relief in my friend's eyes, colleague's eyes. And then the time when you're going there as a helping hand and you're supposed to just take over. So I tell the person, okay, I will hold the mask. You take a breath. You just breathe properly for a few breaths, and then what happened in brief. Just let me, in on the brief history. The first 2 words that friend uttered was, "This is a nightmare. I don't know why I did it." It's a 65-year-old female who is a diabetic, weighing 88 kilos, hypertensive, hypothyroid, on treatment, controlled, doing fine, optimized, and posted for lap cholecystectomy. She was induced with propofol 80 milligrams, scoline 50 milligrams, after sedation with midazolam and pentazocine in the doses that I mentioned. Now here again I would like to mention that I am not going to judge this patient. This is probably the way they are used to doing it. This person is senior to me and has done many more cases. Probably this combination works for them. I am not aware of it, but that is not the problem here. On laryngoscopy, patient was found to have Corman 3. Intubation was attempted twice. Both the times the tube refused to go in. Patient started struggling in the meanwhile, needed oxygenation. A second dose of Scoline was given of 50 milligrams along with a full dose of atropine to prevent any bradycardia. Fair enough. Line was attempted again and nothing is seen. Still nothing is seen. So then they decided to go ahead with a bougie guided intubation. Now bougie was used in spite of not being able to visualize the larynx, and they ended up with esophageal intubation twice. Okay, again the patient is desaturating, again needed to be given. Oxygen saturation started sliding down into the early 80s, and that was the time when LMAs came out of the bag. So again, LMA was attempted. See, this by this point, really, the first operator becomes little impatient, little scared, little panicky, and then the LMA goes in. And this LMA didn't go in properly. It was not, sitting in its place. They were not able to oxygenate. So successful, and by which time there was so much of trauma that was happening in the upper airway, and this is the time the surgeon called for help. Okay, anesthesiologist was busy, and along the way, I was just wondering, acceptable? Is this standard operating procedure? Is this preventable? See, when you are continuously taking lectures, this is how you start thinking. But then anyway, I had to push aside everything, and what I did was, I just examined the patient. Patient heart rate was very good. Blood pressure was again healthily on the higher side, and patient was breathing. So 95, 97 saturation. So I said, let's take off the mask and give her a good ocean. At this point in time, patient started waking up. I wanted to wake up the patient, because here we had to decide, one, whether to continue with the surgery, to begin the surgery, whether to do the surgery, relatives about the problems that we had, and most importantly, what was upmost or highest on my mind was the medico-legal problem here. Because it's very, very common to push off responsibility on the anesthesiologist. That is a common tendency, whether it is the surgeon, the hospital, the relatives, the media, everybody. Somehow I feel they are against us. So I wanted the patient to be away. Here we did a blood sugar at that time. It was 126. So safely we gave again dexamethasone, a loading dose just to take care of the edema and the edema that we had caused. Nasal oxygen was continued. Patient was awake, responsive and oriented, and at this point I wanted one relative to come in and see the patient, because here it becomes very important for the relatives to know that the patient is oriented or anything, because the common message that was being continuously driven home to me was, we are doing this case, we are doing this, no reason to postpone. So if you want to intubate the patient, you please intubate, and we have to do this case today. So I said, let the relative come and see that the patient is fine, there is no problem, and if they are okay, we will go ahead and we will do the case. For induction, I used my doses that I am comfortable with. I gave 100 milligrams of propofol, kept another 50 milligrams, stayed with me on the side. Scoline was given 100 milligrams. After Scoline, I usually tend to give another 20 or 30 milligrams of propofol again. Pyrolate I didn't want to use because heart rate was already very good. I carry a Kingvision blade laryngoscope with me, and I do all my intubations with that. So using a channeled number 3 plate, I was able to intubate this patient very easily with a 7 number PGT. And then they decided to begin the procedure. Cuff inflated, air entry was alright, and the procedure started. They put in a trocar. Stomach was found to be a little dilated, and this was a time when they turned around and said, madam, you can leave if it's okay, because my phone was ringing off the hook. I had a few cases waiting. So they said, it's okay, we are comfortable, if you want to leave, you may leave, there's no problem. So I was washing my laryngoscope blade and getting things done and preparing to leave. The trocar went in, stomach was found to be dilated, so they said an RT insertion will be needed. I asked my colleague one more time whether my head wired. So they said, no, not necessary. I think I can manage an RT. Fine. So I walked away. RT insertion again was a little traumatic. And what was done, McGill's was used. And in the attempt to push the tube in, they managed to avulse the uvula. So again, we have this conundrum of bleeding and clots and no vision and, panic and everything sets in. I was at the door when this, staff nurse comes running and, man, you wanted again inside. And I was like, now what? Has the tube come off or what? I was like preparing for the worst. And then, can the day get really any worse? Again, I took over. The first thing I did was pre-surgery. First thing we need to do when you take over is, stop everything else that is going on. Because when you're doing something here, if somebody else is going to, hanker over there and trouble the patient, tinker around with everything, it gets very distracting. So stop the surgery. Once they moved off, a proper suction was done. Good lighting was taken. Again, we used my laryngoscope, and RT insertion was done under proper vision. There was no time. It went in. By which time the bleeding of the uvula had stopped. They decided that uvula did not require any suturing, so it was, okay, it was manageable. It was just the bleeding that was that they felt it was torn off. It was a small little, a very tiny little incision which healed on its own, not a problem. And the surgery went off uneventfully. So now they are coming to the end of the procedure, and my phone was continuously ringing off the hook. So then I cancelled a few procedures, so just so that I could be there for the case. But then, by which time, my anesthesiologist colleague was comfortable, a little more relaxed, and then we were discussing what to do. So all of us decided, together that there was no point extubating this patient. Patient is going to go on ventilator, and we will think about it tomorrow morning. So then she said she didn't really need me now anymore, because if the patient goes on vent anyway, there's no more requirement for anything. Fine, not a problem. All they wanted me to do was explain the condition to my relatives. Fine, no problem. I went out, I spoke to them, I told them about the need for elective ventilation, SOS, in view of difficult intubation and the trauma that may have been caused due to intubation as well as this. So there was so much of edema there, we said just for tonight we will keep it, and tomorrow we will decide whether to keep or take out or whatever. Patient is not serious or anything. That's the most important here. Reassure the relatives that your patient is not, going to die. Patient is going to be okay. We are going to be sitting here monitoring the patient, and we have this hospital did have an ICU, so we have a good set backup for seeing the patient. No problem. So I left the hospital. Post-op course was told to be my colleague later on. They said that there were very good breathing attempts. Patient was already very howled, so they decided to reverse the patient, but maintain the patient on TP's post-op. This patient was not fighting the tube, was breathing, following orders, doing everything, but not coughing on the tube. So this patient was extubated. She was maintained on TP's post-op, extubated at the age of extubated after 6 hours when the patient really wanted it out. It was okay. Post-op course, the patient was on BiPAP the next day. I got to see the patient on day 3. So this is day 2. Patient was maintained on BiPAP. Physician's reference was taken. Air entry was found to be reduced bilaterally by conditions. And the X-ray picture, he said, was query because of aspiration. So we had that, pneumonia type picture. He said query, it could be aspiration of blood or anything. But patient was starving, and when there was no vomiting or anything, not getting bile or anything. This was the X-ray picture. Now, in the meanwhile, I got some story or background into this particular patient. Now here, pre-anesthetic was done the previous evening. This patient had had no surgical history. There was no history of any cough, cold, fever or anything, but she was a tobacco chewer. That was the only positive she had. There was nothing else beyond that. On examination, she had a receding mandible. She was a little on the chubbier side. Her vitals were unremarkable except for oxygen sats, which were 92%, and rising to 97% on oxygen. So this patient, PAC has been done, everything has been seen. Breath sounds reduced on the left base. Now this is what the anesthesiologist felt the day earlier, but it was not mentioned on the paper. See, this is where we enter into trouble. ऐसा लगा थोड़ा सा, but everything else was normal. So everything else was positive. The only thing that was a little doubtful. Then they thought that probably, there's a little this if I write on paper, so it was not written. The main story here. The surgeon was going on leave vacation for the next evening, which is why this case was posted for morning. Okay, that was why all that hurry and everything was going on. We have to do the case. Everything that needed to be done was actually done in this patient. She was given intramuscular derifylin preoperatively. Astellin nebulization was given. Morning dose of antihypertensive was given. Even the thyroid medication was given. Fasting blood sugar was regularized. But surgeons, you know how they are. They have called another surgeon for help. Both of them want to go and sit in the OPD. One of them wants to pack for their Russian, and they want a fast induction. Anyway, Coming to recovery, as I said, day 2 patient was maintained on BiPAP. She was weaned off the BiPAP the same day after her oxygenation saturations went up. There was no fever or cough, and she was shifted out of ICU on day 3, early morning, day 3. Bronchodilators were continued. Now, this part I went and saw the patient on day 3. Chest PT and deep breathing exercises were taught to this patient. She was extremely uncooperative and totally refused incentive spirometry. It just nahi karna hai. It was very simple to do it. And she was stable. So she made a full recovery, a good recovery rather, and she was discharged on day 7. This was the face. This is the patient, how it was. You can see a double chin over here. And this was the mouth opening. What I learned from this particular case, pre-anesthetic checkup is a must. It was done in this particular patient. Always follow protocol. If your brain says something is wrong, let us trust our intuitions. The 6th step we talk about is absolutely real. Follow protocol. If you think something is not, see, a lap cholecystectomy is an absolutely cold case unless the patient has active compressive cholecystitis and you have to do it right now, impending empyema or rupture or something. Otherwise, these are cool cases. They can always be optimized. This surgeon goes on leave, they can come back and do it, or they can always another surgeon colleague to do the case. There is no need to hurry up. Never ever given to surgeons pressure just because they need to be pacified or kept. There is no need for us to jump our protocols. Optimize the patient. If we felt that the chest is not clear, we have to find out why it is not clear, whether we can do something to help out and improve the status of the patient, and then take up. See, a lot of things go wrong, but then when they actually go wrong, the question comes back to why did you induce? So for my younger colleagues, it's very important to be very in your attitude and your outlook to such patients. Ask for help early. This is one thing that is taught in every field of anesthesia, whether it is a difficult airway protocol or it is a CPR protocol or anything else. The first thing you do is ask for help. Don't wait to fall into trouble and then ask. In all these cases that I have spoken so far, help has to be called for right at the start. There is no shame in asking for help. There can never be compromise in life. You cannot say it's okay this time, I will learn next time. It is never to lose a life. Never ever hurry up because somebody else wants you to. I again say do not buckle under pressure. I could have and I should have a surgeon to stop and not go ahead with this case. We could have done it later. Not that it would have probably changed so much. The course still would have remained the same. But still, there, trouble and a lot of heartache and a lot of stress can be reduced if we could just follow protocol that we have been taught. Never let the surgeons leave the OR. That is one thing very commonly that happens. I will go and speak to the surgeon. No, sir. Please call the relatives to the door. You and I will speak to them together. Teamwork is the key. Involve in the resuscitation process. Ask them to help you out. Don't let them be idle. Sir, please give this, or madam, please give this. Involve them in the thing. So you are involving them in the process of resuscitation. So it is not going to be only your responsibility or only your fault when something goes wrong. They have been there helping you out. They see you working. They understand that you have good knowledge of what you're doing and they're inclined to help you out. Okay? Don't let them go alone. The take-home points here, I would add, would be quick thinking, early anticipation, and timely action is necessary all the time. We cannot forget the two key points that sum up anesthesia on a whole. Eternal vigilance. You can never ever be totally relaxed in an OR ever. You may be at ease, you may be comfortable, but you are never going to forget that we are standing here for this particular patient, that life is in our hands. Whatever method of analysis is employed, back it up with good knowledge of the subject. See, when you don't have things, stopgap things, jugards that we are going to do, they will help you to a particular extent. It does you every time. The same thing is not going to work. So it's essential to have good knowledge. Okay, there has been a problem, there has been a mistake. I am talking about what mistakes have happened in my cases. Go back home, read up, find out what you can do better, have a better knowledge, and use it next time. Always remember, we are all trained and qualified. So there is nothing that is unknown. We are all proper people. And on a lighter note, since we've been on lockdown for so long, what are we doing? Some time goes for exercise and yoga, little bit of time goes on TV and Netflix. There is some time spent by men and women alike these days. Talking about gender equality here, cooking, burning things, learning things, doing a lot of things. We can always keep some time aside for tea and lectures. We have a lockdown period to sort of sit back, chill, think back, go back to your cases. Let us find out what is going on. Let's make best use of this lockdown period. Success is simple. Let's do what is right, the right way, and at the right time. This is a little something my kids and I did today. This was our today's activity. We just wrapped in some twine and put this up. And as I was preparing my talk, this is what struck me. These little glittery bulbs that you see, they are all the mistakes that we have done. We probably mishaps that have happened, mistakes, the mishaps that have happened. Let us utilize them. Let us beautify it, and then let us present this bottle. Let us make our practice more refined, and let it look better. These are scars of our fights. With that, I would just say, I honor the place in you, in which the entire universe dwells. I honor the place in you of love, light, peace, and joy. When you are in that place, in you, and I am in that place in me, we are one. This has nothing to do with a yogi who has been dominating a little bit of space on our social media each day. Thank you all for a patient listening, and I now hand you back to Dr. Vadera. So, you're back on.
Yeah. Thank you, madam, for excellent presentation. It was really wonderful. Everybody feels like it happened to me. It happened to me, and everybody can correlate the things. And I will like to congratulate you that there were maximum viewers till on this presentation. Congratulations, madam. And it is really difficult to. And it is really difficult to share your complications with us, and you did it very nicely. Thank you, madam. And TAS always believes in safe anesthesia, which ensures safe surgery and safe patient. So we will keep following that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.